Thank you for tuning into this video. Today I will be talking about the USDA and the creation of MyPlate and MyPyramid. Now originally this wasn't a huge part of my project, but their creation is much more important than I first realized. Knowing what to eat and how to eat healthy is incredibly difficult. We follow much of the typical advice. Eat fruits and vegetables, get plenty of vitamins and exercise. But when it comes down to the sources of vitamins and proteins and antioxidants, the water becomes much murkier. There is, after all, a plethora of scientific advice out there, much of which is conflicting and contrasting. This is where the USDA comes in. Most Americans will recognize these. The USDA generated MyPlate and MyPyramid. We see them in our public schools, doctors' offices, summer camps, and government institutions. We reference these simplified charts to create healthy and balanced meals, trusting them to provide us with the best possible advice so we don't have to dig through decades of research articles. But this begs the question, how are these guidelines created? To fully understand how we got here, we have to start with what's called Liebig's theory. Liebig's theory was created in the 1800s and concluded that we needed meat to survive. It says that vegans and vegetarians can't maintain enough sustenance for prolonged physical activity. But this can be proven false in a few ways, the first being the mere existence of famed vegan athletes, and the second with updated scientific information that concludes that we don't need meat to survive, and that it may actually be the cause of American heart disease, cancer, and obesity. In fact, the theory was disproved just decades after its creation. But none of that mattered, not once the USDA got hold of Liebig's theory. They used the theory to promote meat, believing that this was the best health suggestion. And at the time, maybe it was. The government began to fund and subsidize meat and dairy, and once the theory was disproved, it was way too late. These industries had poured lobbyists and money into Congress and into the USDA to secure their spot on America's plate, regardless of what was best for our health. Let's check out the USDA, or U.S. Department of Agriculture. This government agency was originally created in the 1800s to protect farmers and increase subsidies. Since then, it has grown into a major sector of the government, overseeing food safety and regulations, managing public lands, assisting food and farming education, and for our purposes, improving public health and nutrition. At its core, however, the Department of Agriculture is designed to protect farmers, not the American people. They are susceptible to lobbyists and payoff from special interests. And these interests are reflected in the dietary recommendations today. So let's check out how the USDA comes up with these recommendations. It starts with the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. This is an organization compiled of scientists and dietary experts that put forward the official advice for every 5 years. This is advice that companies, policy, and regular people are meant to follow. Now, in the past, they have said things like, we need to cut out red meat and sugars and adopt a plant-forward or plant-based diet. In fact, the 2015 to 2020 update said that we should be limiting the amount of meat we eat. What came out to the public, however, was anything but that. This is because there is a second committee that then reviews those suggestions and makes them easy to understand. Unfortunately, the meat and dairy industries have worked to put people into those committees that work for their interests. The results are murky and misleading advice. Going back to the advice to cut down on meat, for example, this was translated into Americans should avoid solid fats, mentioning nothing about meat and honestly not helping anyone. The worst part is that these politicized and misleading tips are used in programs like the Nutritional Program for Women, Infants, and Children, or WIC, school lunches, and they're also served in government facilities. These pieces of advice are clearly targeted at low-income communities, public schools, and those who rely at all on government assistance. In fact, the USDA releases these guidelines publicly, where they explain how these suggestions are created. Here you can see the 3 basic steps to generating official dietary guidelines. But I want to point out one line that says, the advisory report in consideration of public federal agency comments. This is how we get from reducing meat and dairy consumption to meat and dairy being mandated on the federal guidelines. This line has allowed meat and dairy organizations to have a say in our dietary guidelines, organizations that don't have our health as their first priority. This is how we get all those weird translations and total omission of accepted scientific recommendations and facts. The fact of the matter is that these experts have known for decades that red meat was harmful to our health, and that dairy could have an adverse consequence on our bodies. The World Health Organization even called meat potentially carcinogenic to humans, and processed meat was rated carcinogenic to humans. But the USDA has not been reflecting that advice. As a society, we don't have time to scour research articles and trusted sources for the best and safest information. And American corporations have fully taken advantage of that. This is incredibly dangerous as these guidelines are required across the United States. So, in this video, we discussed how guidelines are created and the corruption behind their inception. In the next video, I will be exploring MyPlate and MyPyramid and the flaws within these systems.